Welcome everybody to the CrySP speaker series on privacy. Today's talk will be introduced by our colleague Jennifer Whitson, so I'll just pass it off to her right away.
Hi all, thanks for joining us today. I would like to open this talk with the University of Waterloo's territorial acknowledgement, which acknowledges where our main campus is housed. This acknowledgement may differ according to where you are right now in the world. But we here at the University of Waterloo acknowledge that a lot of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. And actively working towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through our research, our learning, our teaching, and community building. And if you want to know more, you can always contact our Office of Indigenous Relations. Without further ado, I am so happy to welcome Dr. Smith, Oduro-Marfo. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Victoria, and his research focuses on surveillance, privacy, technology policy, and inclusiveness in the Global South. Smith's doctoral dissertation was supervised by Dr. Colin Bennett, Marlia Clark, and Wisdom Tete, and it analyzed the multi-actor debates for and against citizen identification systems in Ghana. And in his work, he focused on 3 national projects in Ghana: the National Biometric Identity Card, the National Digital Property Addressing System, and the SIM card registration exercise. And Smith he has a lot of acronyms. He holds the CIPPC, which is the Certified Information Privacy Professional Canada accreditation, and has been a Weston Scholar for the International Association of Privacy Professionals. He's also been a fellow with the Big Data Surveillance Network, the International Research Development Center, and the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria. Smith is also deeply invested in promoting inclusiveness and equity. To this extent, he was the lead author of the recently published Black in British Columbia Needs Assessment Report and Action Plan. And that report assessed the implementation of the International Decade for the People of African Descent in BC and offered 98 recommendations to the provincial government. So if you're interested in learning or working with Smith, he's also a consultant. And so you can contact him via the information shown on the screen. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Smith, who I also have heard is a wonderful singer. So Smith, please.
Yeah, I mean, I try to sing, but I'm probably doing better in terms of writing the songs and getting others to sing. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know people are joining us from different time zones. I am speaking from the unceded territory, Lekwangwem territory in Victoria. I am very honored to have the opportunity to share the land with the Lekwangwem people and to have the ability here to thrive. This work basically is coming out of my dissertation, which was supervised by Professor Colin Bennett, Dr. Marlia Clark, and Wisdom Tete, and examined by Professor Keith Breckenridge at WITS in South Africa. Let me dig into it. Yeah, so basically, one of the things that I tried to get out of the way right from the beginning is the point that I am not here to say allow surveillance to be because it is useful or because it can be used for development purposes. That is not my argument at all. I'm more interested in the tensions in that thinking. So today my outline simply would be to, first of all, situate the puzzle. Then I'll talk a bit about the Ghana case. I use Ghana as my case study for my dissertation. And then I'll discuss some of my conclusions, and then the floor will be open for questions and comments. And again, thanks Ian for also helping us, Ian and Jen, to set this up. A lot of work has gone into this, and I truly appreciate it. Yeah, So when I started my PhD, my supervisor advised me to start a blog. And the blog basically was to collate stories on Africa in terms of identification, surveillance, privacy. And when I started that work, I began enjoying it, but I saw something very fascinating, that the kind of stories out there about surveillance systems or surveillance-oriented systems tended to be positively inclined, which was very different from the kind of stuff I was reading about surveillance in surveillance studies and in academic literature generally. There was a sort of, on one hand, the concept and the practice of surveillance was gaining a very notorious attribute. It was becoming something that was seen as negative and adverse and that needed to be quenched. And on the other hand, development is seen or deemed to be good. So people saying that, okay, let's use probably they don't even put it that way, but the idea that surveillance technologies can support development for me was irony. It was also paradoxical. How do we bring these two things together? Because development is supposed to be good and we think that surveillance is supposed to be bad. And I could see this idea of promoting surveillance-oriented systems for development, not only in African countries, but then by international development institutions. So the World Bank, for instance, has the ID for the Identification for Development program, the whole program dedicated to promoting biometric technologies for citizen identification in global South countries. The USAID was also promoting, or has also been promoting digital identities. The Asian Development Bank has been doing the same thing. So in addition to African countries themselves, we could also see international development actors promoting the same logics. And for me, that was fascinating. What does this actually mean? What does this imply? So as an academic, I had to situate my tensions somewhere in the literature. And one of the most interesting conversations and debates and arguments in surveillance studies is the care versus control debate. I find it fascinating because I always say that surveillance studies doesn't really see polemical debates. A lot of times people agree that surveillance is not necessarily good. So this was very fascinating for me because it was hot, a very, very hot debate between especially James Harden on one side and David Lyon on the other side. James Harden seems to portray or push the argument that surveillance is not salvageable at this point, especially because of its connections to the private sector, to the corporate world. The argument that surveillance can be used for anything good was a very slippery slope because at this point, it was gone for good in terms of being adverse, in terms of being negative. But David Lyon has a different approach to this, where he thinks more along the lines of ambiguities and feel that there's a care to control spectrum that we should be putting each surveillance project and technology on so that we don't discard surveillance for forever, but try to see, okay, in this particular sense, how can surveillance be controlled and be bounded and fenced in such a way that its adverse implications are put in check. So then one of my favorite scholars, James Scott, reminds us of the fact that for good or for bad, the state must see. And I say that one of the most important works for my thinking about these issues has been James Scott's Seeing Like a State. But to do this work, one thing had to be made clear. The first part is the idea that the ID systems that we are talking about today are very different. David Lyon makes this point forcefully and tries to tell us that we are dealing more with identification systems than identity systems or identity documents. So in the past, it was just a photo on a card. When you go somewhere, you show your card to somebody and go like, this is me. Can you see that it is me? The person says, yes, I look at your face, it's you, and you move on. But now the systems that we are dealing with are very different. They are digital, they tend to be biometrically inclined, they are supposed to be integrated and interoperable across geographies and within geographies. So these systems are truly different. And then Louis Amor also adds the point that these systems that you are dealing with, these identification systems that you are dealing with, are also different in the context that they are based on profiling and risk. So these systems are based on a calculation of risk. So it is not just that this is me, but it is also that based on your profile, this is what we think of you in terms of risk. And this was very much prevalent, or became very much prevalent, in the context of the fight against terrorism. So it was not just about who you are, but then models were being built to say that based on your profile, this is the risk that you come with. And then whether you've done something or not, the state's approaches towards you will be based on that calculation of risk. Then Keith Breckenridge also makes a very good point that slowly but surely and increasingly, the state is moving from the documentary state to the biometric state. And the biometric state simply refers to that endeavor by the state to ensure that there's a universal register of all citizens such that the state has their biometric details. And that means that organizing citizens, protecting citizens, regulating citizens will now have to have a biometric dimension to it. And then the famous surveillance assemblage by Haggerty and Erickson also means for me that by bringing in these identification systems, you are able to assemble a certain assemblage that you couldn't have had if they were just identity documents. And it is on these bases that I say that, well, then you are also dealing with a particular trend that everybody can point to the fact that, oh, ID cards have always existed in African countries in the global south. They can always say that addresses have always existed in African countries in the global south, but we are in a different moment. And that is one point and one maneuver that I wanted to make clear, that we are not just dealing with ID cards, we are dealing with identification systems. Yeah. And I also acknowledge that this is an ongoing conversation that I'm adding my voice to. As I've said already, probably my biggest influence here has been James Scott, Seeing Like a State, and all his analysis about Metis, about technique, and about the fact that the state must see. And one interesting work that I also came across was by Simon Zeta, who was making the argument that maybe one of the reasons why African countries have not developed is because they don't have effective citizen registration systems. So he drew on historical Europe to show or to place birth registration, property ownership registration as variables that led to growth and development in Europe. And as such, if African countries want to do the same thing, then they want to develop, then they have to put in place these same systems. And for me, I felt that, okay, then there is a body of literature that is being developed that serves as a form of power and institutionalizes the idea that registration, that citizen identification and all will be important for development. Then the most probably practical work that has been done on this has been from the World Bank and their ID4D program. So Alan Delp, Julia Clark, and Mariana Dehan have pushed the idea that African countries and global south countries truly need biometric systems for development. And I've already talked about Keith Breckenridge and the prevalence of biometrics in the global south. One other work that has also been very useful for my thinking is by Gus Hussein and Kalanis when they discuss surveillance in international aid. And this work has been important because in the surveillance studies literature, the conversations about the proliferation of surveillance systems have been very West-centric or global North-centric, such that they put up ideas like, military advancement, fight against terrorism, modernization in Europe as reasons for the proliferation of surveillance systems over the years. But one thing that was really lacking is the idea that development itself, and in this particular case, as Hussein and Kalanis point out, international aid was also becoming a reason for the proliferation of surveillance systems, because again, it's based on the logic that, these countries need these tools to be effective and efficient in the first place. Then Emery Schumacher and Tom Keck also talk about the politics of digital identity. And I like this work because it pays attention to the institutions that then become part of implementing the idea that surveillance tools are needed in African countries and the global south generally. There have been critiques that I have liked by Kevin Donovan and Philip Froud and Aaron Martins, all pointing to the idea that there's this idealism that technology, or what we tend to call solutionism, the idea that technology solves social problems is inadequate. And James Scott has pointed this out, that we cannot ever believe fully in the technique, and always we have to pay attention to the metrics, the practical realities, the contextual realities that are of technology. So for my research, my case study was Ghana, and I was basically asking two main questions. How do state and non-state actors justify or challenge citizen identification systems? And what are the implications of framing surveillance systems as necessary for development? For today's talk, I basically focus on the logics along the lines of socio-economic development, but a lot has been said in terms of the usefulness of citizen identification systems, identifying citizens, providing welfare packages to citizens, providing security, fighting crime. All of these have been said. Yeah, so to do this work, I focused on 3 identification systems in Ghana: SIM registration, digital addressing, and national ID system. And my approach really was to look at the narratives of 4 sets of actors: state actors, civil society, local tech companies, international actors. And for each of these ID projects, I was basically interested in how these actors thought about it. How were they justifying it? How were they even contesting these projects? The first project I paid attention to was a SIM card registration exercise. Sometime in 2009 and 2010, the Ghanaian state started pushing the idea that all SIM cards would have to be registered. And till date, I think even as we speak, there's an ongoing registration exercise, which is to say that although the state has really tried to embark on this SIM registration exercise, it has not necessarily been successful, at least for now. But the most important point for this discussion today is how this has been justified in the context of socio-economic development. So for instance, the Subsidiary Legislative Committee of the Parliament of Ghana defended SIM registration in this way, that it is to protect life and property. It is to create the enabling environment necessary for the socio-economic development of the country. In recent years, one of the things that the Ghanaian state and the Ghanaian government has done is to have what they call the mobile number interoperability. So the big or the grand idea is to get citizens to register their SIM cards and then link their SIM cards to a mobile money account, and then link their mobile money account to a bank account, to create that level of seamlessness, but also trackability. So on the part of the consumer, it is easy to say that I'm moving money from my phone to my bank account and vice versa. But then it is also easy for the state to track you then. The second project that I looked at was the National Digital Property Addressing System. Basically, the logic here was that, or has been, to divide the entire country geographically into a 5x5 grid and assign a digital code or a GPS coordinate to each 5x5 grid. So citizens were expected to just download an app, stand in front of their houses, and then generate a GPS. So basically, the idea was to convert the Google GPS coordinates into an intelligible local format, which will show your district, your region, and so that people could easily relate to it and know that, okay, if it starts with AK, for instance, then maybe it's Accra. This has been justified again in the context of socio-economic development. And the Deputy Minister of Communications, for instance, has said that NDPAS will facilitate the formalization of the economy as it provides a unique digital address for properties and businesses for easier identification and tracking by relevant institutions. So here too, the focus has been on socio-economic development. Then the third project I looked at is the bigger or the biggest of them, or the national identification card, or the national biometric card, or the Ghana card. This is supposed to be a smart card. Again, this project was started around 2006, and as we speak, they are getting to the end of it. So again, it's just like the SIM card, where the state has these grand ideas of identifying citizens, but when it comes to implementation, it becomes very checkered, it becomes very belabored. But this is a card that has a memory chip, that has a PKI, and basically it's meant to be interoperable. The grand idea here again is to have 14 different applications on this, which will mean that different governmental institutions and agencies wouldn't have to issue their own ID card. So the Electoral Commission, for instance, will just have an application on this card. The National Health Insurance will just have an application on this card. The Driver's Licensing Office will just have an application on this card. And the idea is to move away from card duplication, which has been a big problem for the country in a very, very, very long time. But if anybody is tracking it, you realize that even after this card has been put out, there are still different cards by different agencies that are also being promoted. And this is what the National Identification Authority has said, or this is what they've said about the National ID card. They say, if your personal information is not in the National Identification Register, you may be excluded from the formal economy of Ghana and lose out on several social, economic, and political benefits. As we speak, they are trying to link the Ghana card to basically everything: social insurance, national health insurance, and you need the Ghana card to get a passport. You need the Ghana card to register your SIM card. So the idea of integration and interoperability is actually being implemented. And again, it may be good for the state, but then it has a lot of tracking capabilities that also could endanger privacy rights and even rights associated to profiling and social sorting. And probably throughout my entire work, this was one of my favorite quotes, and this is by Ghana's Vice President, in trying to justify what is going on, because generally Ghana has what they call the digital Ghana agenda, the idea that Ghana would need to, as they say, digitalize for the country to grow socio-economically. And the Vice President has been the face for this in, I think, about 3 years ago, for instance, because of all of the investments that he's made in these systems. He was nominated and actually won what they call the Digital Man of the Year award. So basically, he's the face of these projects, and his words really carry weight. Here, he says that, I think if we have the digital addressing system, the national ID system, and then you have the interoperability in the digital payment space, you would have dealt with the engine that is going to drive this economic transformation. Those are the unwritten rules of the game, and I think they will have a major impact as far as economic development is concerned. So here it is situated, or these projects are situated centrally in the context of economic development, which fits well into the logic of the World Bank's project identification for development, and also fits into a World Bank-sponsored ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States project, which is also supposed to issue biometric cards across West African countries. They call it the card for inclusion, regional inclusion, yeah, in West Africa. Yeah, so for me, after, and I decided not to bore you with all the details of the interviews and the comments and the justifications that various actors provided. So just really filter everything out. This is what I would say in terms of my analysis of the justifications and contestations. the first part, which for me was very interesting, is that there is a general consensus amongst these actors. So when I say actors, those I identified earlier: state actors, civil society, international actors, local tech companies. They all had this general consensus that, or shared this consensus that actually these surveillance-oriented systems are needed for development. And this is very interesting because then it means that despite the notoriety of surveillance, people, actors, different agencies, organizations, and bodies do not mind that much. They believe that we still need these things for economic development, or socio-economic development. And the key rationales that they provide for justifying these systems have been how these systems are useful for improving security, fighting crime, tracking criminals, citizenship, and economic progress, especially on the idea of proving citizenship, which can be a whole talk on its own. Countries like Ghana, in terms of how they were created, in terms of the arbitrary borders that they've had to live with, have this perennial and long-standing challenge with citizenship. Who is a Ghanaian? The question of who a Ghanaian is has not been answered, and it is not peculiar to Ghana, it's peculiar to a lot of African countries. And these systems, according to the government, will help to prove who a Ghanaian is. But again, we come back to face the challenge of whether technology can leapfrog the institutional dynamics and difficulties that have existed for years. And then the larger key rationale has always been socio-economic progress, socio-economic development. And in all of these, I take my time to also talk about the dominance of economic rationales. So here, it is not just about the states being able to lead development, but it's about the other dimensions of it, the state's ability to extract taxes, which is again tied to being able to identify its citizens. If the state can see its citizens, then the state can tax its citizens and then get those taxes from them. But then there's also the logic of financial inclusion, which again, I justify or rationalize as something that is gaining global institutionalization and is being promoted around the world by international development agencies, that there's a need for financial inclusion. The Ghanaian parlance, they tend to go with what they call formalization of the economy, because the logic again is that there's a huge informal sector in Ghana. If it's an informal sector, then they are not likely to be seen by the state, and taxes can't be extracted from them. They can't be regulated. So the best way to do this is to get them to formalize, so that there's a need for tools that help the state to see them, that help them to also partake in formal banking institutions to access credit and all. But in my work, I really take this to task and question what they really mean by financial inclusion. Are you bringing people in so that they become part of credit ratings, they become part of a web of loans, debts, and credits, or you are bringing them in truly for equity and for individual growth, advancement, and upward mobility? And in all of this, despite the fact that people saw the need for these systems, there were critiques, and one of them was tied to citizenship and exclusion, because some laws that were set up were set up in such a way that people felt, okay, if you're asking me to get a national ID, but only if I have a birth certificate, and then by law I am excluded from having a birth certificate, then it's difficult for me to prove my citizenship and then to get a national ID card. If I don't get a national ID card, then I don't get to register my SIM cards. I don't get to register for a voter's ID. So there's this vicious cycle, which will mean that long-standing issues of exclusion from citizenship, who is seen as a Ghanaian, who is not seen as a Ghanaian, came to the fore in terms of affecting who then can participate in this new phase of so-called digitalization. Then, one big deal has always been privacy rights, but I try to also engage this in a different sense, because I thought that it will be a bigger deal. I did not really find it to be a bigger deal, and I explained why in subsequent slides. Then there was this big deal about corruption. And one argument that I'm developing now, which is to sit side by side with the idea of privacy rights, is that there seems to be a certain level of resonance and issue salience when it comes to corruption. So civil society actors, instead of saying that, okay, these tools can undermine privacy rights, tend to pivot to, oh, there's corruption here. And I'm rationalizing it as them trying to bring up issues that probably have the most shock value, and then get people to sit up and be interested in these issues of surveillance. Then one argument that I make is that identification has now become an international development site. So the SIM card is no longer the SIM card. It is no longer just about, I want to make a phone call. Now it's a form of identification which has implications for you within your state and outside of your state. Addressing systems are no longer places where people used to find people. I want to visit you at your address. Now it's gotten a new meaning, which would even include financial inclusion. The national ID is no longer about, are you a citizen or who are you? Now it has different implications with all of these memory chips, with all of these interoperability leanings. So the larger argument is that we are no longer dealing with identity cards or identity systems. We are dealing with identification systems. But these identification systems have been co-opted into international development pursuits and practices and logics. And one fascinating thing that I found was, okay, if you really think about the justifications for these systems, you may find the meta-narrative as socio-economic development, but what is really underpinning this kind of thinking? And what I ended up with is the idea that the underperformance of the state in the global south is an excuse in itself. So the logic is, if the state is supposed to lead development and the state has not been able to do it, and you are telling us that the state actually needs these tools to do it, then it means that the state's underperformance in itself has become a rationale for accepting this, because then the logic is that we need these systems to cure the inefficiencies of the state, to cure the blindness, quote and unquote, of the state, and then to make the state more efficient. Because if the state is not efficient, then it's, for instance, not efficient in welfare distributions, and this affects citizenship. It is, for instance, not efficient in identifying citizens, and this affects citizenship and the experience of it. Then I pay a lot of attention to the influence of international and local institutions, especially international institutions, because for me, there are all of these systems that are being put in place to push the logic of surveillance for development internationally, and it's getting funded. The big danger then is that the development logic seems to be an existential one. We need to develop. We need socio-economic advancement. We need the state to be efficient. We need the state to see. All these are existential questions. But in the end, when they are situated in the context of surveillance, they tend to decenter other critical concerns. And this is probably why I did not find a lot of people more worried about privacy rights, for instance. And again, because of how existential the development question is, then it becomes a less contested route to building a surveillance state, because you can always pivot to that and say that, oh, we need this for financial inclusion, or we need this for socio-economic advancement. And it becomes easy for that to be pushed through because people think that they need that for development. But as I have said earlier, I truly and really question the inclusion claims that come with this. There's this concept of predatory inclusion. And sometimes I truly wonder whether people are being brought into the formal loop just to be taken advantage of, or they are being brought in truly for them to gain access to the tools that will help them to develop and advance as individuals and as groups. So my big point has been what I call surveillance for development, S4D. And I try to always insist that this comes with a question mark, so that it is not read as surveillance for development in terms of I am pushing for the logic that there's the need for surveillance for development, but rather to situate this as a question to highlight the tensions. Increasingly, institutions have been built locally and internationally to promote surveillance-oriented systems in the global south in the name of development. So if you take the World Bank, for instance, the ID4D program is a classic, it's a very good example of this point. And then there are other appendages like the Findex survey, which tries to take statistics on registration systems, better registration systems across the global south. And again, I emphasize the point that this is in the global south. And this was also very important for me because it allowed me to understand and address the issue of development and say that development as it is used now is a global south thing. And that is why my S4D for me focuses on the global south and not necessarily on the global north, because in the end, even where there are digital IDs, because I know, for instance, in Canada, Saskatchewan and all, there are conversations about digital IDs really in the context of development. Development is a particular category with its own set of power flows, its own set of ideas, and this means that my S4D is specific to the global south context and then places the global north in a certain position also. This is not to discount the fact that there's local ownership, local agency in all of this too. And I insist that these systems are distinct in terms of how they permit continuous, integrated, and non-physical tracking of citizens, attach risk values to citizens' profiles, and permit the creation of multiple selves of citizens. So we are, as I said in the beginning, we are not just dealing with identity cards. I see you, it's you, you move away. But what we have will mean that across geographies, within geographies, in an integrated and interoperable manner, citizens are always going to be in the sites of the state and its allies within the state and beyond. So the utility of the S4D frame that I propose is, first of all, to help us move away from the semantics of identification to surveillance systems. Simply to say that we are not just dealing with identification, and a lot of development actors will just stick to the language of identification. But if you really look beneath and look at how these technologies work, we are dealing with true surveillance systems also. They are not just identifying, but then they are also permitting surveillance. And the frame responds to the argument that surveillance is perpetually dangerous. I spoke about the Harden versus David Lyon debate initially. And for me, that is the position that I've taken, that I stick more towards the side of David Lyon in the control to care spectrum, and that each project will have to be situated within this spectrum and then analyzed as such. We cannot just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. And the S4D frame emphasizes that the trend is mainly situated in the global south. And then it stresses that global south citizens won't only be eligible to the state, but to transnational actors. So for instance, if the World Bank is sponsoring a whole biometric project across West African countries, and they are insisting through the Economic Community of West African States that there should be biometric, there should be these parameters, then it means that the global south state, in terms of identifying the citizens, it's not just identifying them to see by themselves, but also identifying them in such a way that other actors beyond them can also see. For instance, in Ghana, a full round of citizen identification was scrapped after millions of dollars was spent just because it was a 2D card and not a biometric smart card. And that because of that, it didn't fit into international standards. And I note how the existential nature of development could mean broad support for surveillance systems. And the frame also highlights how these same global south countries are the ones with burdened, nascent, and non-existent data protection institutions. So here, there's this proliferation of surveillance-oriented systems, which naturally are a risk in terms of privacy. But on the other hand, these same global south countries are those that have burdened and young data protection institutions with huge challenges with enforcement and even autonomy. So how do we balance these two situations? Yeah, so thank you. I will look forward to very interesting conversations, questions, comments after here.
Okay, let's thank the speaker. Okay, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A feature of Zoom. We have a couple of questions in there already. Smith, can you see the questions yourself, or do you need me to read them out?
Yeah, I can see the questions. So Charles Anaman is asking, where is the database for this system located or hosted? Which company is managing the information that is collected? I don't know which of the projects this is about, but generally, maybe I'll say that the database for the Ghana card, according to the National Identification Authority, is hosted within Ghana. There were rumors in the past that it was hosted by a German company, but they seem to denounce that. And then there were also rumors that the National Digital Addressing System database was being hosted on Amazon Web Services cloud. There too, the state seems to be denying that and saying that it's being hosted on its own service within the country. And the database for the SIM registration is held generally by the SIM, the telecommunication companies or mobile network operators. And Charles is asking again, can't this same S4D be used to recover illicitly acquired wealth by politicians of these global south nations who lose millions yearly to corruption? In essence, this new card can be used as a public key to a blockchain for tracking money laundering. Yeah, I mean, I think that if we are going to think about it in terms of what it can track, then I agree that all of these things can be put there. But in this specific case of fighting corruption, there's always the question about political will and corporate will. And that will be for the state to address. Are we trusting that the state is going to have that will to track corruption or not? And Charles Anaman, probably we can have a conversation about that, because the uses are there. But as to how the state exactly is going to use it is another question. And Asukan, thanks for the very interesting talk. It seems to me that the kind of national identification infrastructure that Ghana aims for is similar to such infrastructure in many countries, including the Nordic European countries. Is this correct? And two, if so, have you or others studied if the types of privacy and inclusion equity concerns you describe have transpired in those countries, or are there other safeguards like regulation in those countries that ensures privacy, inclusion, equity, despite these invasive identity systems? Yeah, I would say that in tracking the debate, one of the things that one of the narratives that I kept coming across is the idea that, developed countries or global north countries did this or do this. This is what developed countries do. And it's one of the issues that I actually engaged a lot more in my conclusions, because if you look deeper, it may not necessarily be the same. For instance, if you think about SIM registration, I don't know where in Canada the kind of SIM registration that is going on is being seen. Because if you take a country like Ghana, where most services are prepaid, people buy their credits or talk time ahead of time. So they don't actually engage in a contract necessarily where they are debited or credited at the end of every month. It's not like that. So here it's, if you register your SIM card, or here in Canada, if you go and register with a phone company, most of the time it's because they have to take money from you at the end of the month. But in Ghana, people are actually paying before they can even talk. So is there really a need for registering SIM cards? And again, is it truly comparable to what happens in Western countries? And in terms of safeguards like regulation, I would say that again, it comes back to institutions and enforcement. One of the logics I'm really pursuing is the idea of enforcement, and whether the level of institutionalization, for instance, in Europe, when it comes to privacy and data protection, it's anywhere close to what we see in global south countries. And if that level of history, that level of path dependency cannot be found in the global south, then can we just say that we've passed the data protection laws, and because of that we can truly regulate? Are we moving away or ignoring the institutional realities that people probably are not used to this, that the institutions of data protection, for instance, are not autonomous, are not independent, they are still appointed by the executive? I mean, these are questions that are nuanced questions and would demand a lot of careful thinking. Thanks. Brittany, thank you so much for an excellent analysis and bringing this topic to greater awareness. Learned a lot today. Thank you, Brittany. Adam, hi. Thanks for the excellent talk, Slade. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the intersections. Where's the question? Did I do it? Between the ID card program and police law enforcement. Thanks. So as things stand, I would say that in terms of function, we've not really seen that, but it is one of the dominant logics that these systems, the ID card, the digital address, the SIM registration systems, are going to help the police to crime. So we wait, because on one hand, these things have been said. On the other hand, we seem to still be in the process of rolling them out and deploying them. So we really, we have to wait to see how this works out in terms of whether truly this can be used to fight crime or not. Is the card being used in the context of low-level policing? Again, it's tied to the answer that I just gave, that in terms of function, we may have to wait a bit for it, because as we speak, they are still in the probably the last stages of enrollment and registration. Okay, put differently, are you seeing function or mission creep beyond questions of corruption? Yes. So there are cognate laws that have been passed, in terms of in the midst of COVID, they passed what they call the executive EI 63. So EI 63 is an executive instrument that is basically saying that all SIM cards and their IMEIs will have to be registered. And you feel that they were taking advantage of the COVID to do this. But once they are able to do this, then it's not just about your SIM card, it's also about your phones. And that means that your trackability increases from, say, 1 to 2. And you bring this back and tie it in with digital addressing, biometric SIM cards, smart cards, then you truly feel that the risk of function creep is high. And Adam, we can talk more about this too later. Alison, many thanks for sharing your exciting research. My own doctoral research looks at birth registration as bordering practice, and particularly practices of exclusion of children of migrants and refugees. I have 2 questions. Please, could you say more about the relationship between deficient birth registration, SIM registration, and the rollout of the biometric ID system in Ghana? Have you encountered examples of exclusion of migrants? How are they being treated in these registration exercises? Or is it that those excluded are putative citizens being manufactured as migrants, to borrow Michelle Foster and Jade Roberts' term? Fantastic, Alison. So the first one is the relationship between deficient birth registration. Okay, good. So basically, one of the underlying concerns has been that for the longest while, the state has not had a consistent birth registration system, such that we can all go back to it and see that there's this underlying starting point where citizens at birth were registered, and we can then simply turn that into a national ID database. It's one of the things that I discuss in my work in the context of the legacies. So I have a whole chapter dedicated to history, and they address these issues of deficient institutions that are unprepared for the kind of digital identification systems that we are putting in place now. And then I also discuss something that touches on your question about migrants. So again, in the context of how the African state has been formed. So in practice, you have people sharing borders that are basically belonging to different countries on paper, but then they share allegiances and identities in practice. And this has always been a major issue for Ghana's quest to identify a citizen. So for instance, one of the biggest complaints has been about people from the Fulani group. So the Fulani group is a transhumant society. They move across West Africa with their cattle, with their head. And they found the national identification registration process very difficult, because whenever they went to register, a lot of them were told that they were not Ghanaians. So they had to move away. There's a big conversation to be had there about the exclusion of certain groups. And then there are certain communities where over time we've seen people move from other parts of West Africa to live there. And then when these enrollment officers go to these communities, they are going there with the preconception that, oh, this community is probably full of immigrants, and then you have to be wide alert. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not right. Sometimes we have people who truly would have been classified as stateless persons, but then they were born in Ghana, they lived in Ghana. Probably they don't have the documentation to prove it, and that became or has become a challenge for them in terms of being recognized. The larger issue is that all of these legacies of the past, in terms of how the state was created, in terms of the challenges with identification, have meant that it is not easy to just use technology to leapfrog all the institutional dimensions and challenges and what James Scott would call the metis. But we can have another conversation about that on the side too. Zia, hello and thank you for your talk. Can you please elaborate more on biometric COVID certificates and SIM cards associated with persons' IDs in the scope of tracking? Also, I might have missed, what are the software companies credited for creating smart national card in Ghana? Okay, so the first part is the biometric COVID certificate. So 2 dimensions to this. The first one is the Ghana government set up an app to track COVID symptoms. It was a failure. Although it was going to collect quite intrusive information, the app truly did not live. It sounded and seemed more like just following blindly what was being done elsewhere, and did not truly work out. The other dimension of COVID certificates, I would say that it's something that I've probably not paid that much attention to in terms of how it is tied to SIM cards, but it's a good one to always look into. The second part is the software companies credited for creating smart national ID cards in Ghana here. So different ones. The one doing the digital addressing system is a company called Vocacom. That is a local Ghanaian company. But basically, people have said that they've taken coordinates from Google's GPS and just localizing them. And then when it comes to the national ID card, there's a company called IMS. IMS is owned by a combination of people, dominantly from Norway and from Ghana, and I think a few owners from the US. But I tend to see it as a conglomeration of IDs, because of ID technologies, what they are basically doing is to also draw on the subtle technologies needed for tracking, for PKI. Different companies around the world have been subcontracted to lend their technologies to a national ID. So if you pick the national ID, you may find in practice 5 or 6 different software companies that have lended their technologies to it in Germany, in the US, and beyond. I might have missed this earlier. I want to know if any of these cards have GPS tracking features. So I would say that in an ideal world, the same registration tied to the International Mobile Equipment Identity Registration, every phone has an IMEI. So if they register your IMEI and they register your phone number and they can tie your phone to you, they can track you. So that is there, because phones are set up to have tracking functions. And then the digital addressing system, purely and straightforward, it's about location. So we should be able to ping you to a certain location. What is not too clear is whether the state is just interested in your location, as in this is your office, this is your house, and that is what we know, or it leaves something on your phone such that once your name pops up, we can then use it to track you everywhere. And I brought up this question when I came across a story in the Ghanaian news about how somebody had gone to steal a phone from somewhere, and the person was caught because of a digital address. I never really understood that, because I thought the digital address was just to say that this is my house, this is my address. But if somebody could take a phone to a different place and then we can still track it, then it means that we are not being told the full story there. Or probably that was just a sort of propaganda message to promote the system that was probably not thought through that well. Kunle, these are my friends, Emilia and Kunle. Necessity and proportionality is essential in creating a surveillance framework, but abuse by public bodies, security agencies is rampant. Do you consider this to be a major factor? I'll say that yes, and we've had these conversations about theory and practice. In the end, I have major concerns about enforcement, because if you look at institutional realities, partisan witch hunting. So one government comes into office, another government comes later and decides to witch hunt the former government. All of these tools are their messy at this point. Right now, there's a huge story about how the National Communication Authority in Ghana bought the Pegasus software, the NSO Pegasus software, and we're going to use it to track mobile phones. But then the concern here is that even when the latest piece on the subject matter came up, it seemed as if it wasn't necessarily the NCA, the National Communication Authority, buying it, but it was their name being used to buy it for a certain political party. And whatever they were going to use it for is not too clear, but you wonder whether a political party actually needs the Pegasus software in terms of how intrusive the software is and what dangers it presents. So for me, there's always going to be that question about enforcement. In the context of necessity and proportionality, we go back to the legislations and see. And to a certain extent, if you look at the Ghana card, for instance, they are taking 32 data points: your iris, your height. And the question really is, does the state really need to know the color of your eye, for anything? Charles, I know
we're out of time, I'm afraid.
Okay, so I'll probably have to answer them later.
Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all the questions. There are a couple still left in the queue. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for asking all your great questions. Let's thank our speaker again. And just a reminder that there's a meeting of Smith with students next. And so if you're a student, you should have received the link to that. And you can come join him in that Zoom room right now. Thank you all for coming.